Hello! So today I'm going to be talking about how we can utilize the player's imagination in order to create interesting play surrounding that. And to get into that, how we utilize the imagination of a player, we need to talk about the game as having two spaces. And this is sort of a simplistic model, but it makes it easier to think about. So take the model I'm gonna explain here not as a this is exactly like it is, but it's more like this is a good concept on how to think about it. So all that said, you can divide the game into two spaces. So we have the system space and we have the narrative space. And system space, we'll get into it more in a sec, but that's the underlying systems, how movement works, how the player colliders are set up, and so forth. The narrative space is basically everything that goes on top, sounds, and you have art, music, storylines, and so on. It's something that sort of wraps the systems in some way, some visualization of it. Or visualization is the wrong word because it doesn't need to be visuals, but you probably understand what I mean. So normally you have the systems as a sort of core, and then you have the narrative on the outside, sort of explaining or giving substance to the systems. And I'm gonna explain this a bit. So let's take a space shooter to explain the spaces. So the system space in a space shooter is you have some player collider, you have some enemy collider, and then you have bullets coming from the enemies and bullets coming from the player. And these bullets are then abstract objects, they're mathematical constructs that looks for conditions and so on and so forth. It's basically a set of rules and mathematical objects. And then you have the narrative wrapping for all of this, which is you are in space. You have space sounds, space graphics, and all of that. And that's what we sort of call the narrative space. And then the rules were part of the system space. And now the important thing here is that, as I talked about in an earlier video, the player has something called a mental model. So I'm going to link to that video below, and it's good if you see that. You're going to get more out of this one, but it's not a requirement. That said, the mental model is that the player sort of takes what they learned from playing the game systems, from seeing, getting an insight into the narrative space, and then they combine that into their own mental imagery, which normally, but not always, is a sort of mix of these two. So they might not think about, say, the moons in the backgrounds as real objects, but they think and might think about the aliens in a more abstract term, and so on and so forth. So what you have is that you have a diagram that looks like this. So we have a system space here at the center, and then you have a narrative space that surrounds that, which is like, so you have a mathematical object, we're calling that a spaceship, we're making that look like a spaceship. But then the player has this mental model, which is how they think about it all in their heads. And that sort of overlaps a little bit. So normally in games, most of the system space is part of the mental model, and we'll get into when this doesn't become the case and when that's interesting, but normally that's the case, and you have like a sliver of systems where the player don't understand it. But normally a game is about understanding systems, so you basically have a model of them in your head. And then you also have, as part of mental model, is that you take some of this narrative space and you make that part of how you envision the game in your head. So for instance, you're not thinking about the ships coming towards you in the space shooter as mathematical objects, you're thinking about them as actual spaceships, and the bullets as bullets. Those are the mental constructs that you're using, and they're provided by the narrative space as context. So, if you're playing a zombie game, you are thinking about it like the narrative space says that I am shooting a gun, shoots bullets through the head of the zombies, and the zombies die. But in the system space, it is like some mathematical projectile that lowers the health when it hits a certain object, and so on and so forth. But those, and obviously these two are very connected, and that's why, as you can probably see, that the system space lies in the narrative space. The narrative space utilizes the systems, and they're not outside of it. So in a way, the player is provided with the narrative space, and this image here doesn't really show it. It's very, very simplistic, but and as they play, they sort of extract the system space. So because the system space is not, in most cases, not directly visible, but it's something that you understand through play by moving your characters and so on. You sort of, if you're playing a space shooter, the spaceship might look like that, but the collision is only on the inside, which is something that you sort of learn, which is a trick in bullet hells and so on. And all of that then gives rise to a mental model as these things go together. So, what can happen is that as the player plays the game, for various reasons, the mental model in the narrative space shrinks. So that can be that the players, for instance, in our zombie game, they stop seeing the monsters as zombies. They're not like, they're not thinking, oh, the zombies are getting to me. They're thinking about, oh, it's another one of those waves of monsters. And what happens then is that the mental model, so you remember, we wanted a mental model that was, this is the narrative space that was presented for the player, but a mental model in the end, when taking systems and play experience into account, is much more simplistic. They're not thinking about the monsters as the game wants to present them narrative-wise. However, and this is going to be a very important diagram going forward, is that as this narrative overlap, you can see here that the narrative overlap went from having all of this to having just this. As that decreases, the fun decreases a bit. You're not longer shooting zombies, so it's like, it's not as fun shooting these boring, in your mind, these things that you don't really think about as zombies. But still, the core, the system is pretty fun on its own, so the fun level only goes down so far. This is a sort of like a safety net that the system space provides, in that, there is a certain amount of narrative that is optimal for the player to have in their head for the most fun. And fun here is it's a shorthand for engagement, but it's easier to write fun. And there's a lot of, like, some experience obviously say a horror game is not necessarily fun, but it's a good shorthand. So what I'm saying is, as this narrative appreciation, or the part of the narrative that you're taking into your mental model, as that decreases, it decreases the fun level as well, but only to a certain limit, because the systems themselves provide so much of the fun that it's not going to go to rock bottom. And yeah, I said earlier in this video that this model of these two circles, there is a lot of like edge cases and other details they get into account, where it's like, oh, but how does this circle fit into this scenario, and so on. And it's not going to hold up under like super scrutiny in every situation. Again, you should think about this as a concept. But I want to just showcase two versions here that are interesting to talk about, just to get a deeper understanding of what I mean. And let's say that systems lie totally outside of narrative. This really never happens. And because narrative needs to have some sort of connection to systems. If it has no connection to systems, that would be like you take a zombie shooter, but you're running around giving flowers to people. Like, it doesn't make sense. There has to be some connection there. And then also another thing that can happen though is that you have some overlap, but that some of the systems are very abstract. So, for instance, in an RPG, you can say that you gain 100 experience point thingy. That is, there's no narrative layer to that. It's basically just, the mathematical model presented as is. That is sort of, you can argue that that's not the case, that experience points themselves, calling them experience points, has some sort of narrative connection, but you get my point, that sometimes you just really present the raw data to the player. So what I'm gonna talk about more going forward is the interesting case when you have a very big narrative space. So the narrative space contains much more than the system space. And when here we can see a lot of the system space is actually outside of the player's mental model, and that the mental model is mostly about narrative space. And a way of thinking about this is that, so here we have it in a different ways of conceptualizing it, is that the player, when the player thinks about the game, in their head is part of the systems. They're thinking about some colliders, some movement and stuff. But as they're playing it, they really have this intricate fantasy. Yeah? Their imagination sort of gives life to the world they're currently in. And these systems here that are actually hidden in the players don't think about them explicitly. They lie in the background and move stuff around, and that could be something like, say, an AI system that uses path nodes or a nav mesh, and the player never thinks about it as there being an actual nav mesh. To think about it as actual agents, like living beings that move around. That's a good example of how system space turns into a narrative space. So in a way, we can think about, in this case, as a sort of iceberg, where below this or above the surface is what you have in a mental model, and below the surface is what lies underneath, unknowns to the player. The player doesn't take that into account as they play, and then you can sort of what floats on the top is this sort of narrative tip of the iceberg, and then some of the systems, but most of the systems are beneath, unseen to the player. Unseen here is shorthand for not part of the mental model. So an example I can sort of give and how this can come about is take, for instance, Resident Evil versus Silent Hill. Silent Hill is sort of like a Resident Evil clone, to be honest, but they feel very differently. So so you can sort of see it like the system space here are identical or very similar at least, but the narrative space goes in very different direction. And for Resident Evil, it's a fairly the mental model here is a very snug fit around the systems, and then a little bit of narrative. There's not much going on in the narrative layer in Resident Evil. It's more tight to the systems, whereas something like in Silent Hill, the narrative space goes in a very different direction, and there is much more of the mental model exists in the narrative space, which gives a very different experience. I think all can agree that it's, for me, that they're quite different, and for me personally, it was quite the different experience from having played Resident Evil. So let's get into how this works and talk about magic tricks. So a magic trick, and let's go over this magic trick here. So the wizard the magician in this case presents a hat. here's the hat, showcases the hat to the audience and says there's nothing in the hat, and then proceeds to pull out a rabbit out of the hat. We can think about this as actually being a narrative space and a system space, and in the narrative space the magician shows the hat that says there's nothing inside. But in system space, there is actually a rabbit inside the hat, it's crammed into the bottom. That's how magicians work, right? The rabbit is hidden somewhere else. But you get the point that this is something unknown to the audience. So in a magic trick, you have this narrative space where the magician talks about how they're doing certain things, they say certain things that are sort of lies. They're not nearly part of the systems. It's part of the sort of theatrical act that they're doing. And for an audience member, if their mental model, they're going to know a bit of the systems, and some of the systems might even be explicit in the narrative of how the magicians say it is, but if a lot of the mental model from the audience lies outside of it and into their narrative layer when they say the hat is empty, and the audience actually believes that, then, ooh, really great magic trick, they're happy. But if the audience doesn't have, none of their mental model is in the narrative space and it's just snugly here in the system space, that's understanding how the trick is done, and they're like, it's a trick, it's not as fun. So you can sort of think about this as in games where we are sort of magicians, and we want to only expose so much of our systems that we get this sort of magical feel. That's what we're after here. So you have to be careful about what systems do I hide, what systems do I expose, and that's really essential to playing with the play, to using the player's imagination. Simple example here of how we do that from Amnesia Dark Descent. So in Dark Descent, and this is probably true for many games, you ride an elevator. So you go into an elevator and you're gonna go down with the elevator. In narrative space, the elevator is on a floor and travels down to another floor, and then you can exit on that floor. But in system space, actually the elevator doesn't move at all. The walls move. So the walls go up and a new exit is presented, and then we load a new level or we switch level or something like that. So when the player feels like, oh, I rode an elevator, much of that experience is actually happening in narrative space. And the system space is actually different. So we're tricking the player into having a certain experience here. Another more intricate example is the sanity system in Dark Descent. So you have sanity, it goes down as you are in dark, see horrible things, and so on and so forth. And the narrative space of this is that so low health is really bad, and narrative space is seeing like spooky hallucinations, hearing voices, and so on and so forth. And all of that is happening in narrative space, which makes player, oh shit, I don't want the sanity meter to go too far down. But in reality, in system space, it's sort of like an auto generating or really auto generating, how you want to call it, system, where if it goes to bottom, it sort of goes up to a safe level. So it isn't as it's not at all as dangerous. It's sort of like if you go down, you can't stay down, it sort of jumps up. So in system wise, it can be beneficiary to just make it run down, but that's not how players play it, because the narrative space tells something different. And then you also have like very simplistic systems, stuff like the screen moving around. So what we have here is it's a very simplistic system, but there's a lot of stuff happening in narrative space. And similarly to the magic trick, that if the player is firmly in the land of the narrative space, like there's some overlap here, that's like they're always going to be there, understand some of the systems. They're like, oh, it's so spooky. Oh, I'm like the sanity system is provides a lot of tension. But if the player like doesn't care about all of those, the hallucination voices are just distraction. They don't think of them as actually dangerous or scary things. Then it's like, this is not so interesting anymore. And remember that diagram I had before on the fun level and the sort of safety net of the system? Now the systems have a very low safety net. You don't really have a lot of safety. As the narrative appreciation, like the part of the narrative space that is in the mental model, as that decreases, well, like this thing here goes in here, or really just disappears, the fun level goes down, and it has, like is here, there's not a lot left until like completely bottom, where it's just really boring. And in this case, it's like there's not a lot of systems left, so there's not a lot of fun level left if the narrative goes away. Contrast this to Bunker, where we rely a lot more on the systemic tension, in that if the light goes out, if the in this case, instead of sanity level, you have like an oil meter here, and if that goes to 0, it's still going to be dangerous for the player. So there's still like a big systemic part, and the mental model sort of encapsulate most of that. There's some parts that it might not, exactly how all runs down and so on. But overall, most of that is in there, and the narrative part is like an extra spice on it, like the whole how the monster looks, the darkness itself, the music and sounds and so on. And then, so if there is like a decrease in fun level as the as the narrative part of the mental model goes down, but it's much higher up, you're still going to have a tense experience, even if you like you don't have any mental model at all of the narrative space. So those, and this is something to think about when you're doing it. And in some cases, if you're very uncertain about players having the narrative, or in Bunker's case where you want to make it very replayable, it's fairly important that you have this safety net here, because if you have it more like this, the moment the player sort of figures out the trick, it's going to run down. And that's similar to how magic trick works as well. Why a performer don't want to do the same trick 3 times, because it's not going to be as interesting when as the audience starts figuring out how it might be done. So the trickery, you can't use all the trickery anymore. Final thing here is so another even more strong example of utilizing narrative space is from Soma. So in Soma, you encounter robots and so on that you have these ethical or morally complex choices around. System-wise, it's very simple. You unplug a cable, and that changes animations and some interaction stuff. Very simplistic. There is really no play going on here. There's like no intrinsic tension or anything in the systems. But in the narrative space, which is really big here compared to the system one, so this is like way larger, there's a robot that thinks it's human, and you're like what do I do in this situation? And the idea here is, again, that the mental model is going to cover a lot of the narrative space. Notice, by the way, just as a side point, is that it's never going to cover everything. There's going to be narrative aspects to a game or a situation that the player will not make part of the mental model. So they might feel empathy for someone, but they might not think of them as an actual real person, and so on and so forth. So that's why we can never really cover the entirety of the narrative space. And then also here, they're going to cover a lot of the system space, and some of it is going to be hidden, but there's not a lot of system space to uncover at all. And here we have an even worse diagram, which is that if you do not accept, like if you don't live in, if your mental model is not has a bunch of narrative space in it, you hit rock bottom. You must plummet. There's no safety net. It just goes whee, boom, it's straight to the floor. There's no catch. So here is the thing, and here is where I think a lot of game development overall sort of goes wrong, is that you but wait a minute, this feels wrong. What if the player doesn't figure it out? How do we solve this? Isn't there a system way of solving this? There's got to be a system. And then you go looking for these systems. That's another thing. I could make a whole video on just this search. But you go looking for this. And there is obviously... I can't rule out that this exists. But I don't know principally how to do this. How to make a system version of this. Like, what would that be? Creating an actual robot to think it's a human. That's ethically very doesn't feel very good ethically. And obviously, I don't know how you're going to go about putting that into a game. It feels a bit bizarre, but overall there might be some other solution that I'm missing. But my feeling is you can't do it, and what that means is that that system space, like the possible situations you can simulate purely in system space, is much smaller than the things you can do in narrative space, because you can have the exact same system setup. We saw that Resident Evil versus Silent Hill, but a very different mental model of what's going on because of narrative. So there's a ton of more experiences in narrative space. So exploring and having things rely on narrative space gives you a lot of more choices. It also comes with this problem, but that's part of the trick. And if magicians only relied on tricks that they could actually do, that would limit the stuff they could do quite a lot. They'd have to figure out ways of actually having bunnies coming out of hats. No tricks. And that's also harder. That's similar to the robot situation. Another reason why it's actually beneficial doing this is that you don't have to connect the happenings to an economy. Like the narrative stuff is sort of outside of the economy. Again, I have to go into more about this. I made a video before about the monster economy, of how once you start adding stuff like ammo and so on, you sort of get trapped in economy, and you have to do certain design choices around that. And we can sort of see that again with Bunker versus Dark Descent, where Dark Descent had various design goals which made it very hard to gamify the sanity system. And in Bunker, instead, the game sort of, took those as a given, so the sort of death and repeat loop and so on. So it had all of those elements, utilized them to do this, whereas you couldn't do that in Dark Descent. To have the sanity system, the game would not play as good, and you would lose out on some experiential stuff. So that's another good thing about this, and it depends on the game you're making. Sometimes you can totally do everything in system space and make that work, or most of the work in system space, have this sort of fallback. Other times you can't, and you have to understand when you're doing that. As a sort of end note here, which is very important, is that narrative space is not look at the pretty pictures. This is, in order for the mental model to be in narrative space, the player has to take this into account in their play loop, which is the game loop's another thing I talked about, which is the whole assess, plan, and execute. So when the player plays the game, not just looks at or listens to the game, they take the narrative thing into account. That is having the narrative space in your mental model. Having the player saying, wow, the graphics are gorgeous. That is not, what constitutes the narrative space. being in a mental model, taking it into account when you make gameplay decisions is. Okay, this video got a bit lengthier than I thought. Hopefully the information was useful. See you next time.